get started. So yeah, good afternoon everyone. I'm Kurt. I'm the Director of Newcastle Social Workers and we specialise in NDIS Support Coordination. And today I'm here to talk about the problems that we're seeing in support coordination across the sector, across the country, at all levels, from an individual level, what support coordinators go through day to day, to a broader structural level. And then what I'm going to talk about is some of the changes that I think we can make at the moment to help to address these problems. And at the end, I'm going to try and leave you with some actionable takeaways and things that we can all do that are just small practical things that I think can help to improve the quality of support coordination services that all of the participants we support are receiving. But that does bring me to something which Chris, it doesn't seem to be here anymore, but Chris's talk on the growth mindset really made me think that a lot of the things in the comments that I'm going to make, especially when it comes to the structural issues that I'm seeing in support coordination, it might sound like I have more of a fixed approach to the way that we should deal with these, but I think it's important to firstly acknowledge that support coordination is about to go through a whole lot of changes and no one knows what those changes are going to look like exactly. I'm going to talk about some of the information that we have and my thoughts on it, but I guess I just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, I understand that even though I have some opinions about the things we can do now while we're still working in the support coordination role and in that framework, that could be completely different in 12 months' time. So I just wanted to start with that. So firstly, what is NDIS support coordination? So one of the first things I wanted to do is just clear up a common misconception about support coordination, which is that all that support coordinators do is refer people to services, or manage a budget. But in reality, when you look at the NDIS pricing arrangements document, it says that support coordination is about supporting participants to direct their lives, not just their services. So I imagine there's probably a fairly varied experience of support coordination in the room. Some people have had experiences working with excellent support coordinators, and we've all had experiences working with terrible support coordinators. And that's something that I wanted to talk about. And really, the key issue that I'm here to talk about today is the inconsistency in the quality of support coordination that's being provided to people with disabilities on the NDIS across the country right now. So yeah, I like to also explain it as being a mashup of a caseworker and a life coach for people with disabilities, which is it's not a way that I've heard the role described before, but I really think that that's probably the most appropriate description, because when you consider that support coordinators aren't just working with NDIS services, we're working with housing, we're working with health, we're working with corrections, we're working with the whole spectrum of services that vulnerable people interact with. It's a much more holistic role than I think people can give it credit for, unless they have direct experience being a support coordinator or working closely with someone or listening to someone like me rant about it for half an hour. So I just wanted to quickly touch on the experiences of support coordinators in the sector right now. So some of you might know Angela Forrester. She's the director of Support Collective. So they're another NDIS registered independent coordination service in the area. So she's posted on LinkedIn recently, "I'm beyond frustrated. Once again, we've taken on a new participant and discovered that most of their coordination funding has been drained within 24 hours of the previous provider being notified of the change." And this is something that might have happened to all of you in some respect, depending on the type of service that you provide. But one of the issues that she points out is once this provider received notification that the participant was looking for a new support coordinator and they'd asked for a different service, that provider has then drained their budget. So not just their support coordination budget, but also their behaviour support and their core support budget. And the unfortunate thing about this situation is it then lumps Angela and her staff with a participant who needs services, although there's no funding for them to use. So they're not able to do an effective job, or they're put in a position where they have to provide those services for free. Has this ever happened to anyone, no matter what type of service you provide? It may or may not have. It has, yeah. Couple of yeses, that's good. It's definitely happened to me and to us. So that's one problem. And as I said, I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of different problems and then we're going to go into solutions. The second one is from Madeline, who also is managing a support coordination service. And she says, with the rollout of the new NDIS 5-year plans and funding periods, which are great at first glance, we are seeing major shifts in how funding is being allocated, particularly within support coordination. One of the most concerning trends is the reduction in funding across many participants' plans. In some cases, allocations are as low as $500 for every 3 months. So that's the equivalent of just 1.3 hours per month, which equates to 20 minutes per week. So she's basically trying to explain how difficult it is for her to meet these requirements. The expectations of her and her team are the same, but the funding that they're being given by the planners has been squashed to almost nothing. So you've got all the service providers calling you, they still have the same expectations for you, the participant still has the same expectations for you, Quality and Safeguards has the same expectations for you, the planners have the same expectations for you, but you have 20 minutes a week to answer everyone's calls and then attempt to act on all of those different things that are going on. So I just wanted to quickly cover those because I think it's important to acknowledge that the funding itself is a massive barrier to the implementation of effective services right now. And that takes me to what's going wrong. So everything is going wrong in support coordination right now at every level. So vulnerable people are being exploited, they're being left without funding and support, as Angela had alluded to. We're also seeing ghosting, so funding is being drained without outcomes. So you're having, in some cases, an independent who's working as a sole trader alone, not as part of a company, and they are going in, doing their job, and then in some cases they just disappear. And so that's another one I was curious about. Has anyone had a participant come to them and say, I don't know where my support coordinator is, I can't get a hold of them, and I have no idea where they've gone? So that's very common, and that's something we see a lot. And that's fine because at an individual level, people have things go wrong in their lives. People get sick, people are in car accidents, things happen. But when you're working in an organisation, you've got a second point of contact, you've got someone you can ring, you've got a way to get that person's life back on track and make sure that the participant is getting what they need. So I think that that's just a key problem at the moment, is the ability for someone to work as an individual sole trader and provide support coordination in the scheme. The funding's being cut and the role's being devalued. So with all the talk of the navigator role, it's sort of like everyone's like, how are we going to prepare for the navigator role? And it's like, well, until that change happens, we have to work with the existing framework and the role, which is support coordination. So I feel like people are sort of getting a bit ahead of themselves in their response to that, and people are going, we don't need support coordinators anymore. And it's like, until that change happens, we need support coordinators, and participants in particular need support coordinators now more than they ever have. And another interesting thing I read recently was that apparently more than 50% of adult participants on the scheme have some form of a cognitive impairment. So when you consider that, I think that the value of having a support coordinator to support a participant like that through the scheme it's worth its weight in gold. You know, without that, they don't have an independent intermediary to support them through that process and to ensure that they're respected and treated fairly. So we're also having providers ceasing to provide support coordination entirely. So they're just going, look, this isn't viable, this is going down the drain, I'm bailing, and that is creating chaos for everyone. So big services are shutting down their support coordination wings, which is the most important thing about it. It's destabilising the lives of those participants. So they're just like, okay, where do I go now? Which I could launch into a few different things off of this, but you know, one of the other issues that we're seeing is entire services shifting their caseloads or hundreds of participants to another provider without asking for consent. So that's another big issue. Good providers like Angela are inheriting the chaos instead of being able to work collaboratively. And another problem I see too is I've had phone calls from independent support coordinators working alone, and they call me and they go, hey, I've been working with 60 participants, but my life's, you know, something's just happened in my own life and I need to hand them all over to you. In some cases, they're people who are in really chaotic situations. They're homeless, they're on drugs, they're linked in with corrections, they're on a community treatment order. There's all this stuff that they need, and they're like, hey, I just need to dump these 60 people on you. And I'm like, this shouldn't be an option. You shouldn't be able to work independently, because without the support of a team, it's just not safe. So the other thing is, we've known about these problems for so long, like the scheme's been in for more than a decade. And this report was the NDIS final review report, and it came out more than 2 years ago. And here's the quote on support coordination. There's mixed feedback on the quality of support coordination. We've heard of some providers that are very highly valued by participants and their families, as well as other providers that are not providing support with sufficient care, skill, or integrity. There is little consistency in the support coordination market, and participants can experience a lottery of whether their support coordinator is effective or not. And I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to this because I don't think that experiencing a lottery in terms of the quality of support that a participant receives is good enough. And I think that there's a clear reason why it's a lottery, and it's because the structure allows for it. It's because the support coordination role hasn't been implemented effectively enough to properly safeguard participants. And once again, this opens up a whole nother conversation, which is about, the rights of people with a disability to choose their own supports. And, you'll see people like Dougie Hurd and other people who are, Natalie Wade, super intelligent and capable people with disabilities advocating for the rights of people with disability. But when you balance that with the fact that, as I mentioned before, more than 50% of adult participants on the NDIS have a cognitive impairment, I think you need to weigh up and actually analyse the true capacity of the population that we're supporting. And experiencing a lottery for those vulnerable people is just not good enough, in my opinion. The final one, there's also strong concern about conflict of interest and client capture when providers of other NDIS services also provide support coordination to participants. This is of particular concern when participants have limited natural safeguards, which is what I've just referred to, and also what Angela referred to in her example. So what's causing all of these problems in support coordination? So there are a lot of different things. The first one is pricing. So I'll go into more detail on that, but pricing is a massive issue. The second is that the system rewards those avoiding regulation. So if you are a registered provider, you're paying for all the expenses we're all familiar with. And if you're an unregistered independent support coordinator who isn't attached to a business, you get paid the exact same rate, but you have none of the overhead. So that's why we see these individuals working with 60 participants, because they're like, mate, I can make 200 grand this year if I have 60 participants. But then when they burn out, which is almost inevitable because support coordination is a really demanding job, both practically and from a time point of view and emotionally, because you're working with people with disabilities, that's not good. The third one is there's no supervision or accountability structures in place for the unregistered. There is a lack of clarity about the future of the role, which I referred to. And the final one is that the conflict of interest or that client capture issue, it makes exploitation easier. So although I think that the vast majority of providers do have good intentions, when someone doesn't, when there's that client capture issue in place, when they're allocating funds to themselves, I'm the support coordinator, I'm going to allocate myself some BSP funding, I'm going to allocate myself the whole SIL budget, and I'm going to allocate myself the community access and possibly even therapy on top of that. If something goes wrong, they go, well, let's just rake 50 grand out of it and bail, which is not safe. It's not good. So the pricing issue is huge. So here I have some benchmarking data from Stewart and Brown. This, unfortunately, is the most recent benchmarking data that I could get, but it's from the 2023-2024 financial year. And this shows the operating margin. So down the middle, you've got the break-even point, and on the left, you've got services that were running at a loss, and on the right, you've got services that were running at a small profit. And as you can see, support coordination, even 2 years ago, was running at such a significant loss for the organisations that they looked at. And I also think it's interesting that allied health would be second, because you'd think that qualified professionals who are registered with governing bodies, you'd think that they would be in a bit of a better position once the numbers had been crunched, but that's just a bit of a side note. There's been a 7-year price freeze on support coordination in the pricing arrangements document. So all the while there's been inflation, there's been increases to workers' compensation, there's been increases to superannuation, and and at the same time, as I mentioned before, the overall funding has been getting less and less and less while we're still expected to do the same job. So I just wanted to point out that's creating a lot of pressure. I've mentioned that there's no differentiation in pricing between registered versus unregistered coordinators. And the problem with this is there's no incentive for the unregistered providers to get registered. I don't think registration is the key issue, but I think that given the current structure, we have to work with what we've got, and it is a really helpful system for creating safety. Another issue, there's no oversight, which is creating risks for participants. So there are no safety checks. So this one does my head in. So if you're an unregistered independent support coordinator, you don't need a working with children check. You don't need a police check. You don't need an NDIS worker screening check. And I've checked with my plan manager friends, and they don't check that these people have those clearances because they're not required to have them. And to me, that's just a glaring hole in the system that needs to be fixed as soon as possible. If you're a sole trader as a support coordinator, you're most likely not having any supervision and there's no second point of contact for participants. So if you disappear, you're gone. And if you've been convicted of fraud or some other kind of criminal activity, no one is even checking. So I think that's just a real massive loophole that needs to be closed. Some people are providing specialist support coordination without the required degree level qualification in a relevant field. So this is happening both in registered providers and unregistered providers. The reason it can still happen with registered providers is because the auditors don't always check for it. The quality of an audit is quite dependent on the individual who completes it. But the criteria is really clear that you are supposed to be an appropriately qualified and experienced professional, and all of the examples they give are people with a degree. It's allied health professionals as well as mental health nurses. But if you're unregistered, they don't check your qualification. So you can just put your hand up and say, I'm a specialist support coordinator, and just send your invoice in, and no one's going to check because they're not required to have it. The final one is that services are being provided by people who don't have any training, experience or qualifications, which is, again, not good enough for some of the most vulnerable people in our community. Okay, so here, quite often I hear and I read on LinkedIn, I'm like very active on LinkedIn, scrolling, that's like my new doom scroll, but I often read that support coordination is dominated by unregistered providers and that the whole market is unregulated, it's unregistered. And when I looked at the data from the June quarter of 2025, you can see that graph paints that picture. So it looks like 60% of the market is made up of unregistered support coordination providers. And then the smaller percentage is 40% registered ones. So when you look at that, it looks like, yes, the numbers of providers, it's dominated by the unregulated. But when you come over here and you look at the total billable hours that were claimed, which represents the total amount of work that's getting done, unless you want to get into it and say, oh, well, the unregistered providers aren't sending in their invoices. It's like, we all want to get paid. We don't want to work for free. As much as we are coming from a good place, we're not going to work for free. So I think this is a very accurate representation of the work that's being done in support coordination right now. And what you can see is it's almost the total opposite. So you can see that the funds claimed by registered providers, the total billable hours, represents 77% of the total. So this tells me a few different things. The first is that registered support coordinators are already doing the vast majority of the work. The other thing is that it also shows me that registered providers of support coordination also have a greater tendency to work in teams, which I think is a really important thing for participant safety. So, because how could there be more unregistered providers, but they're doing less work? The unregistered providers are either working in smaller teams or they're working alone as individuals, which is a safety risk. So I just wanted to point that out. The other thing that's really important about this is for the mandatory registration conversation. So again, I don't think that's the key issue, but they were supposed to announce mandatory registration for coordinators in July. July's come and gone, now it'll probably be a next year thing. That seems to be the next likely shift in support coordination. And I've seen so much conversation around it and people saying, there's no way they could register all of the providers, and I kind of agree with that. I think that registering every single provider across the scheme is an almighty task for the auditors and all the compliance people, but in support coordination in particular, I think it's a very achievable task. Like, I don't see it being a problem, especially when you consider almost 80% of the work is already being done by registered providers. So if these guys are working in either really small teams or alone as individuals, they might not even need to get registered. They might just need to get jobs with the existing registered providers, which would, in my mind, be easy. So why does registration for support coordinators matter? There are a few reasons. So as I've just mentioned, the unregistered providers aren't required to have those clearances, which I don't think is good enough. I think the standard's way too low, and I think that just improving that alone would make a significant difference to the quality of supports that people are receiving, because you're not having convicted criminals and people who are fraudsters just jumping in and taking the funding and leaving. The other thing is there's no independent auditing or oversight. So no one's looking through their books. And another thing I've heard from independent coordinators and people who are working at unregistered providers is, we don't even keep case notes because we don't have to. We just do our jobs, we make the referrals, we make the phone calls, and that's obviously a massive problem in terms of accountability and documenting in general. Whereas a registered provider has all their qualifications checked and verified. You need a working with children check, you go through regular audits, which there is a lot of debate around the effectiveness of audits. That's like a whole separate topic, but I still think that some form of audit does make you lift your game, it makes you clean up your systems, and it makes you provide the information that you should have on hand. The other thing is there's some mandatory training element that comes with being registered. So all staff have to complete the NDIS worker orientation module, which I'm sure most of us have done. And I think that in terms of mandatory training, again, some is better than none. So I think that that's an important requirement. The next thing is the lack of certainty about the future of the role. So everyone's heard of the navigator role, right? Yes, everyone's heard about it. There's a lot of speculation around the navigator role right now. Initially, the navigator role was intended to be a mashup of plan management, support coordination, recovery coaching, local area coordination, and then all the liaison officers. So the JLOs, the HLOs, and then education liaison officers. The whole thing's up in the air, so there's a lot of just speculation around how this is going to play out. But interestingly, in the briefing to the most recent minister for the NDIA, plan management wasn't included in that briefing. So I think that they're changing their approach in that, and it looks like support coordination will still be included in that. And it really does bring up a few questions of like, well, why are they doing it? Like, why would they go to all this trouble to do what's essentially turning into a classic like government rebrand of support coordination? So far, what I can see, I've read a few papers, like NIB put out like a position paper basically trying to, from an economist saying, look, this is how that navigator role would work. This is why we're well positioned to provide this service. And I think that the main thing is it's a market consolidation. So it looks like they're trying to bring, instead of having 7,000 something support coordination providers that they have to regulate, they're going to bring it down to something more like 30 or 5 or 80, and there were different models within that report around the nature of that. But I just thought that was an interesting thing to share, although it's all still speculation for the meantime. Here are some ideas that I have on how we can fix it in the meantime. While we're still stuck with support coordination, like it or not, I think that there are some practical things we can do, some easy things that we can do to help to improve things for the people that we support. The first is just mandatory NDIS worker screening checks for all coordinators. Make that a rule and make it happen by like March. If you can't get that, tough shit. Seriously, if you can't get that, you shouldn't be able to work in the disability sector. That's fine. Plan managers can check that. There's no delay in that. That doesn't need to wait. I don't know why that's not already existing. The second is having pricing that reflects the compliance requirements of registered providers. So I'd like to see differential pricing brought in where registered providers get paid one rate, unregistered providers get paid a lower rate. Most of you are probably familiar with the disability support worker cost model and the way that they break that down into chunks. And it's like a little column graph, and each chunk accounts for a certain expense that you have in order to provide that support. I think support coordination, they need to do the exact same thing and just go, okay, if you're unregistered, that huge chunk off the top of that $100 an hour that you're getting paid, that's gone. And you now get 50 because in reality, you don't have any of these expenses. So I think there should be some acknowledgement of that in order to make the marketplace more fair and, most importantly, more in favour of participant safety. Next is mandatory registration for support coordinators, and I don't think that should be first, and I think that the problem with putting it first is that the pricing isn't right. So it would just puts more pressure on an already overly pressurised role and service to attempt to provide. The good thing about it though, and one of the most practical elements, like I know you can get into all the nitty gritty of like registration and some of the points I made before, but I think the most practical benefit of that is that people are more likely to work in teams when they're working in a registered provider, because you have to account for those registration costs. So I wouldn't register a company as an NDIS registered provider and then go, I'm just going to continue being a sole trader because I've just paid $10,000 to get registered. Now I'm going to have to pay old mate, thousands of dollars for the next audit to come sit with me and go through all my books. So I need to get that money back somehow. So that just builds in natural accountability because if you work with someone else and they ask you what you're doing, you have to tell them. So that's just a natural safety element that I think should be brought in. Next is designing and implementing some mandatory support coordination training. I think that it's a role that's so important and that affects all of the providers in the room to various degrees, I'm just like, where is the training? Why is there not mandatory training that we should all have to do? It doesn't have to be a university degree, it doesn't have to be a TAFE course, but there should be something similar to the NDIS orientation module, a set of modules that guides you through and explains these are going to be your responsibilities, here are some of the ethical considerations, and here's how we want you to deal with it. I just think that would be so easy to do as well. Especially when you consider DSC already have an advanced support coordination course that's out and you can do it, it's like $500. I'm like, just make everyone do that. If you want to get paid $100 an hour, you need to do a $500 course. Again, it's not much to ask. And if they wanted to make it more fancy, then they can mash it up with the Disability Intermediaries Australia. They have a like professional standards of practice for support coordination, and they could just weave those in. They could just, I think that they could get that done in a matter of like a month. I don't see why. Like, the course is literally online now. Just make it a rule. And finally, making a rule that's, I'm all about rules in case you can't tell. I'm clearly all about rules. Make a rule that support coordination needs to be delivered independently of other services, because this addresses the client capture issue that we've known about for so many years. And again, that's an easy one, but I think that the order is really important, and I've put that last. Although I believe in it, I think that that's last because all of the other things have to be in play in order for that to be feasible. So that's all the problems out of the way, which there are many. So what does good support coordination look like? So I'm sure you've experienced the benefits of having a good support coordinator. The things that we see lives change for the better. We see people finding houses, we see people abstaining from drugs, we see people engaging with therapy, we see people accessing the community more, we see people reconnecting with their families. We see all these life-changing benefits, people starting to address their trauma in therapy sessions, and all of these awesome things that come as a direct result of having a good support coordinator. And that's why I'm so passionate about this topic, is because I see the benefits all the time. As much crap as I have to deal with day to day, the benefits, when they happen, do outweigh the crap, for lack of better words. The other one I wanted to mention is that it's just less stress for you as providers. So having a well-trained, qualified support coordinator who's not a criminal would be great. It's not much to ask. So I just think that the way that improves the whole system is an important thing, so it's worth acknowledging. So some things that you can do right now. The first thing, which I think is just super practical and easy to do, is check that the person that you're referring, because we all know, oftentimes a participant comes to you, they say, oh, I need a new OT, who should I go to? Or, oh, I'm sick of so-and-so, I want to change to a new cause. Consider checking that the coordinator you're referring to is working in a team. Because whether they're registered or unregistered, I think that just working in a team itself is such a good protective mechanism for the participants that we support. The other one is consider referring to local independent registered support coordination companies. And the reason for that is because it addresses the client capture issue. If you refer someone to an independent coordinator, you know that they're not going to capture that person's funding and then leave them in a situation where they're left without supports that they need. Oh, this is an interesting one. So you can provide input for the quality and safeguarding framework. So I just completed this quiz the other day. I only found out about it the other day, but they're asking for our input as providers or participants as well. I looked at the page, and the page had about 20 different links on it, and it took me 5 minutes to figure out how I could actually give my feedback. So I've posted that link on my LinkedIn profile. So if you were interested in having input on that, I obviously was, because I'm all about the rules and improving things and closing these gaps in the system in terms of safeguarding. That's a really good one. So if you are curious about that, check it out. It only took me about five minutes to fill out, but it's worth checking out. Support the push for pricing reform. So we do need it in support coordination, and I think that we all need it, honestly. Like, the financial modelling of the NDIS is definitely questionable at best at the moment, especially for the people who are trying to do it right. Did you want to say something?
100%.
Yeah. He's backing it, that's good. Consider joining or having a look at Disability Services Exchange. So this is a collective action for small to medium registered providers, which is going to try and push for all the things that we need: mandatory registration, pricing reform, just adjustments to the system that address all of the pain points that we all have in common. I don't think there are any other support coordinators or plan managers in here, are there? No, that's okay. But I had something for them too, which was to consider following Disability Intermediaries Australia, because they provide really good sector updates, and you can learn a lot from what they share, but it is specific to plan managers and coordinators. Yeah, so thank you. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to talk more about it and yeah, continue this conversation elsewhere, but I'll take some questions now if anyone has any. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Questions?
That was extremely insightful. I didn't realise I was so ignorant. I had no idea that you could actually be unregistered as a support coordinator.
Yeah.
I thought it was compulsory. That's just
No. It's crazy. Yeah, it's crazy. It's actually crazy. And I think that's something I forgot to mention is that there are actually some really great unregistered support coordination organisations out there, and some of them were previously registered but chose to let their registration lapse in order to be sustainable, because they're like, well, look, we're already set up in an office. You know, some of them started 10 years ago, and then as the squeeze got worse and worse, they just went, it's not worth us being registered, you know? So I think it's important to acknowledge that, again, like I don't feel like registration is the be all end all, but it is definitely a key part of the puzzle.